Now, it's kind of a miss, but I'm not including Nixon in this because Nixon I really put to the 70s. So really, I'm talking about Kennedy and Johnson here. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here. People love this because the Kennedy assassination and everything. And we'll get there, okay? The first thing is the election of 1960. Now, the election of 1960, we have a very young Jack Kennedy, as he was sometimes called, running against the uh, more seasoned, more experienced, 8 years as a vice president, Richard Nixon. Okay? Now, religion had a thing to do with this and who was going to do the Cold War, but where it was won and where it was decided, as you can see here in the picture, was on the TV. The TV really decided a lot. So what do we see on that fateful day? Well, we have the debate. Now, we saw Kennedy rather, as being very postured, and a lot of women said he was attractive, and he looked like, although he didn't have the answers, there was something about him. Now, what do we see about Nixon? Nixon was on TV sweating because of the heat of the cameras, and he was also, constantly doing that. Now, if someone goes on TV and they're sweating and they look angry, two things come to mind. Number one, he's lying, and number two, he's lying. So they didn't want that, and so he loses the election basically because of public perception. He gave some pretty good answers, but public perception really won out. Now, JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his running mate is Lyndon B. Johnson, and they run on the subject of the New Frontier. Now, the New Frontier embarked on 3 areas that we're going to address. The first area would be the space race. We've got to do something with the space race. We're behind. And later, and much, much later, actually in the Nixon era, we reached the moon. And that's an interesting concept. The next thing is the Cold War. We've got to figure out what to do about the whole thing of the Cold War. Thirdly, we have poverty. Kennedy and Johnson were big into trying to solve poverty in all its phases. And lastly, civil rights. Now, and that was the actual order they went in. And everyone thinks that Kennedy and Johnson were all very gung-ho about civil rights, and in fact they weren't. That's why the marches and the protests and everything like that were necessary to get them to go. Now, Kennedy is afraid, especially after Korea and things like that, of a nuclear war. And so he has actually recommended that he start building up what is called flexible response. Now, flexible response means we're going to keep our nuclear warheads ready to go, but we're also going to build what is called a conventional military. And if the Soviets want to fight with conventional military, well, we can do that. We don't need to threaten them with atomic bombs if they're bringing tanks. You've heard the expression, bringing a knife to a gunfight. And maybe that holds true here, if you will, but that's the idea. So, the idea under Kennedy in the Cold War is to maintain what's called the missile gap, if we go back to that. And that is where we have a more ratio. So, how do we do that? We keep the ones we have, we don't make any new ones. A crowning achievement of Kennedy is called the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Okay, Limited Test Ban Treaty said we're not going to have any new nuclear test, only the technology you have, and it's to slow things down. Now, a really interesting thing and key thing about this is Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, is told, Mr. McNamara, they're going to cheat. And he cheat? How do you cheat? And the people said, the Russians are going to beat us to the moon, and they're going to test nuclear weapons on the dark side of the moon. Now, this freaks them out so bad. If you notice there in 1953, really after Test Ban Treaty, we really start pumping money into the Apollo missions to get to the moon, and we win the moon race. And maybe that had a factor in it. Probably it did have a factor in it, right? Now, some other accomplishments of him. He starts an army of doves, if you will, that is now called the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, the whole goal of the Peace Corps at this time, and maybe today, is to prevent people from falling into radical beliefs. In 1960s, communism. Today, maybe radical Islam, jihadists, etc. So, the whole idea behind the Peace Corps is to go into a developing country, a third world country that is susceptible to communism or terrorism or Islamic jihadism today, and basically modernize them, bring them to the good times, and hopefully, they'll focus on that stuff and not fall into the other paths that we don't want to. Now, we have the race to the moon, right? Now, the space race is from 57 to 75. It is a major part of the Cold War because who controlled space could potentially put lasers. Yes, Star Wars people. Reagan, come on, if you remember that. So the whole idea is who gets there first, all right? Now, if we're keeping a tally here, there's 4 big really events of the space race. Number 1, man-made satellite. Russians got it. Number 2, creature in space, also the Russians. Number 3, a person, also the Russians. And number 4, the moon hasn't been accomplished yet at this point. So we're 0 for 3. We got to get a victory. We win the race to the moon. This happens in 1969 on the Apollo 11 mission. And the first man to set foot on the moon is Neil Armstrong. And we've heard the saying many times, this is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And there's actually been a ton of debate, was it staged, etc. And there's tons of conspiracy theories you can just, worry your brain about for hours and hours if you want to. But I don't have time to get into those today. All right?